On November 1, 1943, Lieutenant General Alexander Vandergrift, a veteran of Guadalcanal, watched the coast of Bougainville appear in the morning mist. In 2 hours, 14,000 Marines of the 3rd Marine Division would land at Empress Augusta Bay. This operation was a necessary step towards the ultimate Allied objective, the capture of Rabaul. General Douglas MacArthur called Rabaul the key to the theater. Admiral Ernest King identified it as the primary objective for 1943, leading to the approval of Operation Cartwheel to encircle and capture it. However, military planners saw a severe problem. Rabaul was a fortress that dwarfed other Pacific Island battles. Since capturing it in February 1942, the Japanese had spent 20 months transforming it into the most heavily defended position in the South Pacific, an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Simpson Harbor could anchor 100 ships, and 5 airfields, Lakunai, Vunacano, Rapopo, Tobero, and Caravat, ringed the area, capable of sheltering over 400 aircraft. The defenses included 367 anti-aircraft guns, 43 coastal defense guns, and 6,000 machine guns in bunkers and pillboxes. The Japanese army had also carved hundreds of miles of tunnels into the volcanic rock, creating underground barracks for 20,000 men, hospitals, ammunition dumps, and command centers that were impervious to bombing. By mid-1943, over 110,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen were based there. This concentration of Japanese military power was nicknamed the Pearl Harbor of the South Pacific. Planners estimated that a conventional amphibious assault would be catastrophic. The Japanese had learned from earlier island fights and built defenses to counter American naval gunfire and air superiority. The tunnels neutralized strategic bombing. The anti-aircraft fire made air support murderous to deliver. The sheer size of the garrison meant achieving numerical superiority would drain forces from every other theater. With only 3 narrow, heavily fortified landing beaches, intelligence analysts estimated a 30% casualty rate. Planners projected that an assault involving 60,000 troops would cost 18,000 killed and wounded, and that assumed everything went right. Historical consensus is that Rabaul would have resulted in far more bloodshed than Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. There had to be another way. The first major American effort to neutralize Rabaul came from the air, led by Brigadier General Kenneth Walker. Walker was a theorist who believed strategic bombing could win wars without ground invasions. His early raids, starting in September 1942, failed. On January 5, 1943, Walker personally led a daylight bombing raid on Simpson Harbor, hitting the most heavily defended target in the Pacific at high noon. His B-17 Flying Fortress, the San Antonio Rose, was hit almost immediately, lost altitude, and crashed into the water. Neither Walker, his crew of 10, nor the wreckage was ever found. Walker was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously, and remains the highest-ranking American officer still listed as missing in action from World War II. The raid failed to stop the Japanese convoy. A second massive airstrike on October 12, 1943, involved 349 aircraft. General Kenney claimed over 100 Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground and runways cratered. MacArthur issued press releases declaring Rabaul's air power neutralized, but this was untrue. Japanese engineers repaired the runways in 36 hours. Most fuel dumps had been empty, and the Japanese lost fewer than 20 planes. Rabaul remained fully operational. Another costly raid followed on November 2nd, the most dangerous mission the 5th Air Force had flown. The Japanese had reinforced Rabaul with 173 elite carrier aircraft just 1 day prior. Major Raymond Harold Wilkins led his squadron into Simpson Harbor and destroyed a Japanese destroyer and a 9,000-ton transport. Though his aircraft was heavily damaged, he made a final strafing run on a heavy cruiser to draw fire away from his squadron, crashing into Simpson Harbor and killing all 6 crew members. Wilkins also received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The raid cost 19 Allied aircraft and over 60 men, but barely touched Rabaul. By mid-1943, commanders concluded that strategic bombing had failed because Rabaul was too big, too well defended, and too easy to repair. The ground campaign in New Guinea was also brutal, marked by dense rainforests, steep mountains, and tropical diseases like malaria and dengue fever that incapacitated more soldiers than wounds. The fighting at Buna and Gona lasted 3 months and cost thousands of Allied casualties to clear 2 small coastal villages defended by 6,500 Japanese troops. The fighting was desperate, with Japanese bunkers absorbing bullets and requiring flamethrowers. Commanders realized the Japanese would not retreat or surrender. Every position had to be taken by direct assault. If Buna cost 3,000 casualties for 2 villages, the cost of Rabaul was simply unacceptable. Operations continued to take longer and cost more than estimated, moving the front line closer to the strongest defensive position in the Pacific. The concept of bypassing fortified positions stretched back to Major Errol Hancock Ellis's 1921 War Plan 712, proposing to defeat Japan by capturing key islands while isolating others. In June 1943, the Joint Strategic Survey Committee formally questioned whether capturing every Japanese base made strategic sense, arguing that if American forces controlled the sea and air around Rabaul, the base itself became irrelevant. The key advocate for bypassing Rabaul was General George Cadelet Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff. Marshall viewed the war in terms of logistics and casualty ratios. He calculated that assaulting Rabaul would require at least 60,000 assault troops and incur 20,000 to 30,000 killed and wounded. He argued that Rabaul was a base, not a strategic objective, and capturing it accomplished nothing that isolation couldn't. Independently, General George Kenney also realized that while Rabaul couldn't be destroyed, it could be neutralized. He argued that if Allied forces could build airfields within fighter range, they could continuously sweep over the base, crater runways, and block supply by sea and air, leaving the garrison trapped without invasion. Admiral Ernest King reached the same conclusion through battlefield experience. On August 15, 1943, Halsey implemented the first pure bypass operation by landing troops on lightly defended Vella Valera instead of the heavily fortified Kolombangarenga. The operation succeeded brilliantly, and the Japanese evacuated Kolombangarenga 6 weeks later without an assault.
MacArthur was initially negative, as capturing Rabaul was the culmination of his strategy. However, Kenney persuaded him by arguing that by bypassing Rabaul would save time for the advance toward the Philippines, MacArthur's obsession. By early August, MacArthur reluctantly allowed contingency plans for isolation to be developed. The ultimate decision was made at the Quadrant Conference in Quebec in August 1943. Marshall presented his case on August 19th. Admiral Ernest Joseph King supported him, stating the Navy could not support both the Rabaul invasion and the Central Pacific offensive. One had to be sacrificed. MacArthur's representatives argued for capture, predicting it would leave a dangerous threat in the Allied rear. Marshall countered every argument with casualty figures, asking directly, how many Marines is Rabaul worth? 20,000? 40,000. The British Chiefs of Staff sided with Marshall. On August 24, 1943, the combined Chiefs of Staff issued their directive. Rabaul would be neutralized by air and naval action, but not captured. The fortress would be left to wither. MacArthur, who had opposed the bypass until overruled, pragmatically shifted strategy, choosing to leapfrog across New Guinea and redirecting forces toward the Philippines. The bypass strategy was immediately tested on November 1, 1943, with the Bougainville landing. Rabaul dispatched a cruiser force to interfere. Admiral Halsey ordered carrier strikes on Rabaul itself. On November 5th, Rear Admiral Frederick Homan Sherman launched 97 aircraft from the carriers Saratoga and Princeton. The strike caught the Japanese cruiser force at anchor in Simpson Harbor and put bombs into 6 of the 7 heavy cruisers. The attack, which cost the Americans only 9 aircraft, was called Pearl Harbor in reverse. The Japanese combined fleet learned that Simpson Harbor was not safe and never sent another heavy surface ship to Rabaul. The Marines established their beachhead on Bougainville unopposed. Within 3 weeks, they built an airfield, and by early December, American bombers were hitting Rabaul from 250 miles away. By January 1944, Rabaul was completely surrounded. Allied airfields on Bougainville, New Breton, and the Green Islands maintained constant pressure. Fighters swept over Rabaul daily, bombers cratered the runways nightly, and Simpson Harbor became a graveyard of sunken ships. The 110,000 troops were cut off and trapped, unable to receive supplies or interfere with Allied operations. The success led to the bypass strategy spreading across the Pacific theater. Admiral Chester Nimitz applied it in the Marshall Islands, bypassing heavily fortified bases and capturing lightly defended ones. MacArthur used it in New Guinea, bypassing Japanese concentrations at Modong and Wewak and landing at Hollandia, hundreds of miles west. Historians estimate the strategy saved over 100,000 American casualties and accelerated the Allied advance toward Japan by months. The Japanese realization came slowly, then all at once. They assumed the Bougainville landing was a diversion and waited for the main invasion that never came. By February 1944, Japanese commanders understood they were being bypassed. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, the base commander, had prepared for a decisive battle on the beaches, but never for being ignored. Kusaka realized the Americans had already defeated Rabaul without capturing it. The garrison was ordered to plant gardens and prepare for a siege, as the war was lost for Rabaul the moment the last supply convoy turned back in January 1944. The psychological impact was devastating. For 2 years, their strategy had relied on making the American advance costly, but the bypass strategy destroyed that logic. It did not matter how well they fortified a position if the enemy went around it. By late 1944, Rabaul was a prison. When Australian forces entered Rabaul in September 1945, they found approximately 69,000 soldiers and 20,000 civilian workers still alive, with over 20,000 having died from starvation, disease, and malnutrition. Kusaka, who returned to Japan, said the worst part of Rabaul was waiting for an enemy that never came. The 110,000 Japanese soldiers sat in a fortress for 18 months, defeated not by battle, but by strategic irrelevance.